Tom and Betsy especially for organizing this and for getting us all together to be able to talk about this as a group. Let me get this open. There it is. See eventually? There it is. So a little bit about me. I am not a theater person. I'm not. Aside from the very literary aspects of it, the canonicity of it, studying the trajectory of German theater, my experience with theater proper is extremely limited. Basically to going to theater productions, and as I joked, I think I dated somebody that was in theater in high school. And that's pretty much the extent of it. So I do literature and culture and theory and stuff like that, post-45. That's kind of my shtick, if you will. So I was coming at this from a very different standpoint. Namely, I know how to teach. I've taught for years and years and years, all levels from beginning language, intermediate, upper division, graduate courses. So I have experience in that regard. So when thinking about how to do this particular course, and I'll get into what this course was, and all of those types of details, I kind of fell back on certain tried and true methods that I knew had worked previously, and this gives me the opportunity to again reflect on those practices again, kind of a Freudian secondary revision, if you will, after the fact, right, in the aftermath of the production that was put on. So my title is bland, admittedly bland. Normally I put a little more creative flourish into this, but at least it speaks to exactly what I'm trying to do, right? For somebody that was coming from never having done theater before, never really taught theater before, never having had put on a production before, even being behind the stage, right? So things that go in the classroom to prepare for this type of thing, to put on what will eventually be a student-led production. I took out the beyond the classroom because I really want to focus today, right? I mean, I only have so much time in the first place. On stuff that I did in the classroom, right? If you want to know what happened outside, during rehearsals, during all the nitty-gritty of production and design, more than happy to answer any of your questions either after this or during the lunch break, but I really wanted to focus this in on what we were doing in the classroom and why. And again, reflecting back on some of my own pedagogical training. Again, I am not schooled in SLA, I am not a pedagogue. My experience comes basically from the methods course that I took, and then basically trial by fire in classrooms, right? That's pretty much it. So before I begin, I also want to just mention a few things. Most of what's coming today is very much novice reflections. I'm a novice. These aren't novel, right? These aren't my things necessarily, right? A lot of this came from my predecessors, Martin Boimel, who was here a couple of years ago and has moved on to Wesleyan in Connecticut, who put on the play before me. One of our excellent graduate students who is no longer here, Margot Blevins, who was his TA, and then my graduate assistant as well. So really taking from their experiences what worked for them, what didn't work for them, taking those ideas and kind of refashioning, reforming them to certain extents. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Lisa Parks at Harvard in their German department. She was kind enough to come here, I believe, in spring of 2015, spring of 2016, and give a very similar workshop to our German department and some others as well, as far as how to do language pedagogy. So again, these aren't necessarily my ideas. This is nothing new that I'm presenting to you. I cannot take credit for them in any form or fashion. That's basically what I'm saying. These have been reappropriated, retooled, and inspired by many people that had come before me. Cool. So I've divided this kind of into 4 parts, what I want to do today, moving through how the class worked, from its conception, its design, through what we did in class, working with the actual play itself, how the syllabus was constructed, some ideas for lesson plans activities, and then some, at least flashing forward into how production and staging developed in the classroom, before we actually moved into our stage and started actually putting stuff on. So, what is this course? This course has a long tradition here at UT Austin, especially in the Germanic Studies department. It began with Dr. Wolfgang Michael in 1947. who basically did a play, it seems like every single semester until he retired in the 90s. So just imagine how many plays he was actually able to put on. That's him standing up on the right, and his long-time co-conspirator in theater and his production manager and business partner as well. Of course, it continues today. We do this every other year, or we try to do this every other year. Yeah, so this has definitely a history here. This is an upper division course. But even within the sequence of courses, even within the curriculum, it is very particular in the fact that you only have to have first year German to be in it, right? Normally you would go through, first year, second year, maybe some, advanced grammar stages, conversation and composition before you're thrown into the upper division sequence of courses. But this was not the case, right? So it posed, at least for me, when thinking about this, advantages and disadvantages. At least initially I thought, right? And what later became more or less opportunities. So the advantages, of course, right? You have this great student body, a mixture of students that you don't normally get at the upper division level, right? The disadvantage of this is how do you cater to this not having a baseline, or having a baseline that's so, I wouldn't say low, but not normal for an upper division course, right? How do you keep those that are more advanced, that might be heritage speakers, or at least have gone through years here, semesters here? How do you keep them entertained while also educating them? And how do you not go way over the head of the students who are just coming out of the first year and really having to delve into a difficult text on multiple levels of interpretation, right? So in thinking about this, it really became more or less of an opportunity. And this is going to be somewhat pedantic, and I apologize for that, but in thinking back on these things, we can return to the, I would call it now, the infamous 2007 MLA report, right? Everybody knows about it, we all talk about it. It seems to be one of those things that, has kind of gone away in the sense that, again, everybody knows about it. But in thinking back on this, it really brought some of these points to the fore, right? Really bringing language, culture, and context into every level of instruction, right? Not just beginning when you get into the upper divisions, right? This was one of the big stakes that this report was offering, was saying we need to get away from this bifurcation of language. Now, we only teach language for the first years. You're conjugating verbs, you're dealing with funky articles and different cases that we don't have in English, and really splitting the curriculum in two, right? You do certain things, and then you get your language and culture and all of that good stuff, right? We've since known that this is at least hopefully long since gone, right? But again, for me, it at least posed an opportunity to really put this into practice and reflect on it again, right? As far as what we're doing curricularly, right? The really cool thing about this, and that I experienced despite my fears going into this, right? How to cater to the lower-ish division students and the upper division students, namely by thinking about how these different experience levels really get to interact, right? It's always difficult on the one hand for those that are more advanced to make themselves even understood, right, to people. They think that because they can speak the language so well that it's just understood when they say something. That's not necessarily the case. The other way to view this as well is the fact that this reticence on some of the students that are just coming out of the first year to be thrown into this classroom with students who have been to Germany, right? It might be heritage speakers, have some family, might have spoken it at home or something like that. The intimidation factor of coming into this and feeling that you don't belong, right? So there was this interesting dynamic that I saw often flipped, right? It was the lower division ones that often had a lot more to offer to the class in a lot of ways than the advanced students did at certain times. And so this exchange of information between these levels, I think, was hugely productive, right? And really speaks to this fact that we don't necessarily need to bifurcate the language and culture curriculum. And again, this all comes down to, and this is going to be kind of the red thread that runs throughout this, is precisely the negotiating of meaning. And this isn't me, again, this is from Claire Cramsh's work, Context and Culture in Language Teaching. Right? This is all about negotiating meaning at all levels throughout the class. All right? And I will come back to this as far as exactly what I mean by that. So the first place to start is a play. What do you choose? Why do you choose it? How do you choose it? Right? Where do you start? These is just a smattering of things to consider. Relevance, right? Is it topical? Do you want to tie it into something going on today? Do you want it to be reflective of something, anything? Socioeconomic, political, historical, whatever, right? Canonicity. I know a question that for somebody that does science fiction isn't really big to me necessarily, but something that needs to at least be considered in terms of accessibility. Namely, can they access this text? Is it something they can actually work with on a very different level? Is it something that they can go and find YouTube stagings of, for example, to see how it looks, smells, and feels, so to speak, right? So not just canonical in that way, right? The play that I did was kind of in between there, right? Interpretability and malleability. This is another weird thing. I was trying to find a different way to phrase this, but the sense in terms of, does this play offer up space for playing around with it, right? For really flexing the imagination, for really interpreting it. And of course, all plays are interpretable, right? That kind of goes without saying. This is super subjective. It basically comes down, can you imagine your student doing something with this? Can you imagine yourself doing something with this text, right? And also in the sense of not approaching a text as something that is ready-made, right? Here it is, this is how we have to do it, this is how it's been done, I have a preconceived notion of how this text is supposed to, how this play is supposed to look, right? Can we play around with these things? Another thing to consider is the roles. How many roles are there? Is this a one-person operation, a two-person operation? Do you want to switch up the roles at all? Are there enough to offer those students who want to take on different parts, big, small, and in between? Ultimately, is it going to be fun and enjoyable? This is something you're going to be spending a lot of your time with, right? In and outside of the classroom. Do you like it? Do you think your students are going to like it? Is it something that you are going to want to dedicate your life to for perhaps a semester and do it, all right? Because if you don't like it, you don't want to do it, it's going to get really old for you, and that's going to show through to your students as well, right? It's got to be enjoyable. The play that I chose was Wieder mal die Brandstifter, or The Arsonist. That's what I'm used to use, just so you can take a look at the text. This is a play from 1958 by Max Frisch, a Swiss author, dramatist, kind of jack of all trades. I chose this for a couple of reasons. One, because I like it. It is absurd. It is somewhat of a dark comedy. It is a satire. It's political comedy. It's everything and nothing, right? There's so much you can do with this. Even as far as the stage directions are concerned. There's no setting that's mentioned, right? We presume it's Switzerland, Germany, somewhere in that Central European realm perhaps, but it doesn't say, right? We have the time just from the time that it's published and the way that the characters act, so there's a lot of room, again, for malleability, right? What we want to do with this. It was also a text that I knew had different student versions of it, right? It is difficult in the fact that it also has a chorus, right? It goes back to this old school kind of Greek chorus idea, but much more in a Brechtian fashion, if you will, right? So it has the opportunities for the major roles and then for minor roles for students that want to be up there in a group and really do something along the lines of a chorus. It also states its purpose in its subtitle, right? As a didactic play without a lesson, which again offers up so many things, right? What does this play want to get across to its audience, right? What does it want us to learn from us? What does it even mean that it doesn't have a lesson if it's didactic, right? And when you take these things into consideration, so many different avenues for engaging with this. Just to give you a brief rundown of what it is, it's basically a bourgeois couple in the 50s. There's a string of arsonists going around their town, and these two arsonists come knocking at the door, convince this couple that's deathly afraid of the arsons that they are not arsonists, even though they are, and slowly start to stack gas barrels in their attic, right? And the couple just convinces them, oh wait, no, this This isn't happening to us. That's not them, right? That's not the arsonist. This couldn't be happening to us. We're not that stupid when it's going on right under their noses the entire time. So for me, this also had political relevance as well, right? I didn't want to really hammer that in. I was hoping they would kind of come to that on their own, but that's why I chose this particular one. Oh, the syllabus. Memes, I know, I try to be cool, it doesn't ever work, but memes. So the way I divided this was into 3 parts, right? The interpretation, the message, the thesis stage, right? What is this play about? What do we want it to be about, right? Production, design, and staging, and lastly, the rehearsal phase in and outside of class, right? Participation is always key for me, it's always hugely weighted, but this is also how I did casting. I knew from the beginning we weren't gonna have time to really do casting, right? To come, read a line, really vet everybody. So participation was how we did it. If you want to roll, and I told them this from the very beginning, you are being judged every single day. Do you participate? Are you on time? Do you do your homework? Is it late? All of these things came down to it. Wasn't if you were the best actor, if you're the most experienced, did you participate in class? Did you do your work? That's how we did casting ultimately, right? The homework for this, I've taken to using Canvas discussion forums for a lot of reasons, and we divided this into 3 stages as well. So basically, content questions they could work on at home, video and voice recordings, picking out a scene, recording it through Canvas and putting it up there so people can see it, right? Analyzing why you did what you did, and then again, coming back to accessibility, can you find other YouTube versions of this and see what other people did? What perhaps their interpretation of this play was, how they went about producing it, designing it, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course the obligatory essays that were meant to kind of tack into all of this, right? Tack onto it and tap into it. So the interpretation and thesis stage, and the production and design, and I'll talk a little bit about that hopefully if I have time in a minute. And then presentations for production groups, right? Not everybody gets a role, there just isn't enough roles, not everybody wants a role, right? But there's something for everybody to do, right? There's so many moving parts here that there is something for everybody to do. But also in the way that this works with, I was hoping all of the skills, right? Reading, writing, speaking, and listening, right? Really moving through all of those, but also moving through the different stages, right? How do you interpret a play first? What is its message? How do you really get into the nitty-gritty of it once you have your thesis, so to speak? How do you produce it, right? What do you want it to look like? So not only being transparent with what my expectations were for the class, which is always a good thing to do on a syllabus, but really being transparent with the logic about how and why we're moving through the semester, the way we're moving through the semester. Right. Whether this came across in the end, I don't know. I hope it did. That was the intention. Okay. All right. So getting back to negotiating meaning, right? This is what I'm talking about from the very beginning, from day-to-day activities to basically working with the text on a whole, right? This is, again, is taken from Cranch in the sense of, we're talking about classroom activities on the one hand, right? Non-native speakers interacting with other non-native speakers, exchanging information, negotiating meaning in class. What do you mean by that, right? Can you explain what you mean by that? I'm not sure, all right? Non-native speakers working with native or near-native speakers. This can be the instructor in front of the classroom, you yourselves as a resource, or even with the more advanced students in class, right? Those who have more experiences with the target language, right? How do they interact and exchange information, right? How do those at the lower level make themselves understood? And how do those at the higher levels make themselves understood to those at the lower levels, right? And then ultimately negotiating the meaning of the text and the play itself, right? The big takeaway, right? And there are 3 stages to this, right? Moving basically from the linguistic, the information and symbolic value of words. What do they mean? What do they mean literally? What do they mean symbolically in the context of this play, right? This comes down to basic stuff such as pronunciation and prosody. Eventually you're going to be performing this. How should these words sound? What should be intoned? What should be stressed, right? What do these words mean again, and what do they connote, right, within the world of the play? Moving to situational and interactional, this is when you get into the realm of group work especially, right? Negotiating meaning. How do we want to perform this, right? How do we want our character to be? What do we want to emphasize? What kind of effect do we want it to have on the audience, right? So working both within the text and outside of the text itself, right? How are these situational aspects represented within, and how do we interact to produce them ourselves?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
For clarity here,
Absolutely.
How much of this negotiation as you're getting into, you're getting to now intertextual,
Yeah.
cultural, how much of this is being done in the language, in German?
All of it.
All of it?
All of it.
That's okay.
All of it. All of it.
Even for the first year students?
Doesn't matter.
Or second year students?
Doesn't matter.
It's okay.
From day one. I'm a firm believer in as much of the target language as possible.
Mhm.
I'm not that firm of a believer that I don't recognize there are moments when you need to step back from the target language just to make sure everybody's on the same page, and there are just certain things that perhaps you can't do. But, right, really from day one in the target language. That's how it goes. There's no other way to do it. You can't backfill later. All right. So as much as possible. And again, this is all implicit. Right? This is the logic behind all of this stuff. And the trickiest one is intertextual, intercultural, what the MLA report will later term translingual and transcultural, right? All of these good buzzwords, right? But going for global apprehension of context, right? Not only understanding the target language and the target culture, but also your own culture, your own language as part of this social construction of language and culture and context. So can they bring in their own experiences, their own personal experiences, their own theatrical experiences, films, plays, books, etc., to draw on in order to get them to produce something that we want them to produce at the end. We can't have them say, okay, now you are a German, you are in German shoes, that's it, right? We can only provide so much authenticity in the classroom, and to insist upon it at all times would be to deceive ourselves to a certain extent. Right? So how does this work actually, right? This is, I'm getting into some more of the actual activities that we use. I'm skipping a lot of the preparatory stages where we talked about the context of this play, the content of the play. So assuming that this kind of heavy lifting has been done, right? What happens in the play, who comes out, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, all of that stuff. Moving on to really dealing with the characters themselves, acting, interpreting, all of that, right? So one way that we can do this is by working with just basic nouns, verbs, and adjectives, right? Collecting a list, right? We have, let's say, 4 main characters in a play. What do we know about them? How would you describe them with an adjective, a noun, and a verb, right? You get this great list on the board, right? This is a time where everybody as a class can kind of just throw out stuff, right? Really working with vocabulary, but always connecting this to, again, what we know about the content and context of this play. Right? From there, you can divide them up. You've got 4 different characters, 4 groups. Choose from one of these pairings that we have, right? Which one do you think most speaks to this character, how you've understood them, right? And then taking these different pairings, adjectival, substantive, verbs, etc., performing the same, with the emphasis on that character and those particular attributes, right? And then, right, the audience has to guess, right? Which attributes were chosen, right? How did they act this out? What did they choose to emphasize and why about this particular character in the play? The idea behind this is, again, connecting this very basic linguistic work, right? What we know from the play itself, what they know from their own vocabulary, and connecting this back to situational and interactional meaning, right? Can they decide on what they want to do for their character? Can they negotiate amongst themselves, no, I think it should be like this, and why, and decide upon that, right? At every stage, I have tried to kind of build this in. Right? Another way to do this is through images, right? And this really gets across the idea that theater is not only a text, right, but is a very visual medium, right? People are going to see you doing this, right? So how can you take these attributes that you know and stage them? How would they look? How would they look? To kind of get them out of the realm of the text, I provided them with images that I hope they hadn't seen before, right?
Please. No.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I have learned that all of my pop cultural preferences completely fall on deaf ears. I am not up to date whatsoever, and what I think I'm up to date on, I am absolutely out of date on, right? So I just presume that my knowledge of stuff we just aren't on the same plane whatsoever. So I tried Casablanca. A couple of them did, for sure. They were nice and kind, not to blur out, this is Casablanca, this is the character, right? But just from taking a still, right? What can we determine about these different characters, their relationships to each other, right? Visual, right? What are they wearing? What does this tell us about the time? Who these people are, right? Situational, right? Where are they, right? A bar, a restaurant, something like that. What does this tell us about the characters? Facial expressions, body language, positional. Again, getting them to work with stuff they already know from the very basic level, right? They can say, this person looks sad. That's something you come out of first year knowing how to say, right? So again, these lower level students can contribute, and often much more, right? They see things that some of their more advanced students perhaps don't pick up on. And that's the cool thing to watch, and see those that think they're smarter, right, really come crashing down and say, well, maybe we can, challenge these hierarchies within the classroom as well, right? And again, the cool thing to do is pick stuff or with which they're not familiar, right? And they have to describe the scene. Where are they? Who are they? They can be creative, right? They don't know anything about this, right? So they have to infer all of this. They can be creative. They can make up a story, but they have to explain it. Right? Again, we're back to negotiating meaning at all times. What do we want this story to be? Well, I think it's this. I think it's this. Well, why? Right? You have to explain your work, so to speak, right? So I gave them this as an example, and then I gave them a slew of other stills from stuff I know they hadn't seen. Is anybody familiar with any of these? Where these come from? Okay, my good Germanists do. Where are these from? Yeah.
Or Here Eats the Soul.
Yeah. These are all Fassbinder films.
Yeah.
Kind of enough Fassbinder films from the 70s that I know most of them had never seen whatsoever, right? So they are forced to, right, come up with a story for this. Who are these people? Why are they there? What are they doing, right? Why is she wearing a leopard print costume? Outfit, right? Is this a circus? What the hell's going on here? I mean, they can really flex their imagination to come up with a story, judging on, or based on a slew of visual body characteristics, facial expressions, et cetera, right? So it really gets across the idea that whatever they're going to eventually be doing is going to be seen. So it's not just the words that you say, right? It's how you look, how you're actually positioning yourself in performing on stage, right? And then, of course, always going back to the text at hand. So from that, you can do a tableau vivant, right? Why not? Why not? A lot of fun, right? Students are given a scene from the play, right? Time is always of the essence. So pick out scenes ahead of time that you want them to work on, that you know, right, are possible to do a tableau vivant with. Some are better than others, right? And they have to stage it, right? How would they position themselves, right, with the other characters on stage, right? Well, what would their gestures and facial expressions be, right? They have to stage it, and then again, the audience, the other classmates have to guess what scene this is, right? And explain why they thought that. And then on the back end, right, the students that stage it have to explain their work too. We did this stage, we did this because this is what we wanted to impart, right? This is the particular atmosphere we wanted to create, and we did this because, right? So again, this goes back to connecting words with images, and both of these with the content in context of the play itself, right? What we've already established moving through before we get into this stuff. And I've got my cool little hyphen in here because we're all academics, why not? So this is kind of a pre-formal stage. Before you even start acting, before you can put lines into their mouth and have them do stuff, right? You have to make them aware that they are going to be on stage. And everything they do matters, right? So you gotta pre-form certain things, right? Certain ideas and aspects before you can even get into the performing part of it. Question, I know I move fast and I tend to speak even quicker when I'm moving along. Good? Cool. So once you get these pre-formed stages down, right, the idea that this is visual, this is relational, this is situational, Then you can move into the acting, right? And one of the funnest things I thought was improv, with a lot of levels, right? We did this in 2 ways. I'm only focusing on one here. We did a much more complex one in English first, right? For a lot of different reasons, right? If you provide them with improv scenes, situational improv scenes, you've got to be sure they have the requisite vocabulary to be able to act out those scenes. So to give you an example, one of the ones I came up with in English was criminals on the run, right? Which taps into what was going on in the Arsonist, but could also be expanded. But for those students who don't know how to say to flee from somewhere, to hide, or to escape, right? This can be tricky, right? So getting them to improv first, perhaps in the native tongue or English, before moving on to the actual play itself was really helpful. And here's my chat. Derrida. Yes, there is an outside to this text. I know that's not what he means, but there is an outside to the play. If you want to become a character, you've got to know how they would think, feel, act in different situations, right? We've done all this preparatory work with how our characters are, how we think they are, the adjectives, the nouns, the verbs that would describe them. We know how they act within the setting of the play itself. How would they act elsewhere, right? If you're on stage and something happens, right, how can you pick back up and keep going with stuff, knowing what you know about the characters already, right? So how would they act in a grocery store, in a bar, in a restaurant, on a plane, right? Anywhere, right? This can be done as a short writing exercise, writing a dialogue in the voice of the characters that you choose to portray. And then, of course, performing this, right? Short dialogue does not have to be long. What's the problem? How would these characters, knowing what we know about them, deal with this particular situation, right? Is somebody an asshole, right? Would they really berate the waiter or waitress, right? Is somebody super passive? Would they do nothing, right? What do we know about how would they act in these certain cases, right? This also interestingly taps into their broader cultural and linguistic knowledges of the target language, again, stuff that students coming out from the lower levels should know. Food items, how to order stuff, right? Works with these different levels of meaning, again, tying it back into the context and content of the play itself, right? But assuming that they should know coming out of the first year language, these vocabularies, these verbs and nouns in order to be able to do this type of stuff. And this, of course, always leads into an essay, right? But I didn't want these to just be writing assignments for the sake of I have to grade something here, right? I have to give you something back. I have to give you feedback. I have to help you as writers. This, of course, is also the case, right? I'm a literature person. I want to know if you can interpret a piece of literature. I want to know if you can make an argument. I want to know if you can conjugate your verbs properly to a certain extent, right? But I also want this to be a part of the larger negotiating of meaning of the play itself, right? What is your argument? What do you want this play to be about? What do you want our audience to get out of it at the end of the day? That's a thesis statement, right? How much more impactful can you make the idea of coming up with a thesis statement? Normally it's just blah, right? Okay, I have to have an argument for the student.